Organized labor started with noble intentions. It started really to represent workers that were frankly working through difficult working conditions. I mean, think about the coal mines, think about the steel mills, think about child labor and 12-hour work days, 7 days a week. So organized labor started at that time to represent those workers, give those workers a voice when they were being taken advantage of. But over the course of time in both the private and the public sector more so, they started to become these political animals. They started to realize that they could take money from workers and use that money to buy political candidates, pay for political races, and then they could have influence in elections.
And that influence, it comes from the teachers union, the public sector union, and the trades and construction. These unions built massive war chests, and that's how they bought their influence, and still do today. And this is important to understand. Their power, it doesn't come from the workers, it comes from the government.
And if you go back far enough, even to the Wagner Act in 1935, what we call the National Labor Relations Act today, that was championed by U.S. Senator Robert Wagner from New York. And that was viewed as a gift to organized labor, as a means of establishing and enshrining in law, in federal law, a role for unions in labor relations across the country when dealing with private employers.
So there's a step towards, or a step away from, sort of a privatization of unions in the AFL, sometimes analogized to syndicalism among European theorists, where workers would be the ones who would take over the industries in which they worked.
And I think from that time forward, unions realized that to really entrench themselves as an entity, as an industry really, they needed to rely on the power of government to do that. They needed to receive protection under the law for their operations.
In fact, several of the CIO unions were dominated by the Communist Party. But it wasn't until the Wagner Act in 1935 that ordinary, unskilled, and easily replaceable workers got the federal government on its side. And ever since 1935, the federal government has had the policy of trying to promote labor unions.
And many of the individuals involved in the organized labor movement in the late 1800s into the early 1900s had sympathies with Marxist ideology, with socialism as an economic model, and viewed unions as a vehicle for advancing that class struggle.
Historically, the class struggle is best described in the Communist Manifesto, which was written by Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. It's the platform for the Communist Party. Marx and Engels called for a workers' movement under this banner of communism. And of course, that means it's anti-capitalism. The early days of the unions were setting the stage for class warfare.
Essentially, the fundamental terms were determined by the fact that we had a market economy at the time. So the socialism, to the extent you could describe it as such in that time, was socialism in the sense of class warfare, with less of an emphasis on government policy, less of an emphasis on the traditional economic tenets of socialism and Marxism involving government control of the means of production.
That's kind of the socialist mindset that the unions have when representing workers that now applies to their political ideology.
So as we get into the 1930s, the labor movement is growing, of course with the help of government. But union workers, they weren't happy with just organizing workers in the auto industry and trades and construction. They had their sights set on organizing government workers. In a nutshell, Franklin Roosevelt, a progressive Democrat, knew that was crazy.
In the early days, it was unthinkable that public employees, for example, could be represented by a labor union. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a friend of labor unions, a friend of the working class, or at least certainly portrayed as such, was critical, very critical, of the concept of collective bargaining and unions in government.
He was petitioned by a head of somebody who's trying to establish a union for federal employees, responded by saying, of course you can't have collective bargaining mandatory in the federal government. If you did that, you would make the unions the sovereign. They would be taking over the government.
Roosevelt was ahead of his time. He recognized that if you allow for public sector unions, government unions, then what you're allowing for is you're allowing for politicians to be sat on the other side of the table as the people that they're negotiating with.
And in FDR's view, allowing government unions and collective bargaining essentially short-circuited that democratic process and gave one small segment, one small interest group, outsized control over government policy and the operations of government.
Eventually, politics won out. The American Federation of Government Employees was formed in 1932. And then in 1962, President John F. Kennedy signed an executive order allowing government employees to organize. While the teachers' union formed in the early 1900s, they were politically disconnected until the late 50s, 1960s. And then in the 1980s, they had political action committees in all 50 states. The New Deal transformed the unions. They took national positions, started backing Democrats almost exclusively and their progressive agenda.
The suspicion that the AFL unions had of government power before this meant that they were nonpartisan. They would say, we have no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And their policy would be to reward the party that supported them and punish the parties that opposed them. And the Democratic Party became the more union-friendly party.
So unions have been tied to the Democratic Party basically because they realize that Democrats will go and raise taxes for a price. So if you're a public sector union, especially teachers union, for example, and you pay for the campaign of, let's say, Brandon Johnson, the new mayor of Chicago, he agrees to go into office on the agenda of raising taxes so that they can hire more public employees and therefore get more union dues. And then when it comes to his re-election, these unions have more money to give to his campaign. It's a cycle that's been ongoing in America for 70, 80 years now that's never been challenged. So we actually have taxpayer dollars going into political campaigns that favor one party that is unchallenged.
Unions are uniformly the interests of bigger government, of more expensive government, of higher taxes. Like any industry, like any business, they want to increase revenue, they want to increase membership. And in their world, they do that by making government bigger, more expensive. And when you look at the two major political parties in America today, the agenda that best lines up with those interests is the agenda of the Democratic Party. And so we've seen organized labor as a whole essentially become entirely grafted into the political apparatus of the progressive movements in America today.
The most unfair on project labor agreements is simple. It's giving up ownership of your company. That's exactly what it is. If you're a construction owner and you sign a PLA, you have literally put your own people on a bench to hire union workers. There is no way in hell that's fair to anybody. So you know what that contractor does? He doesn't bid on them.